Hello, welcome to Saturday afternoon at the Scottish Summit. This session is entitled How Azure AD Authentication Works. My name is Reid. Thank you very much to our sponsors who make the Scottish Summit possible. Please encourage you to visit their websites and to inquire of their services and how they can help you. In our 45-minute session today, we're going to be looking at how Azure AD Authentication works. My name is Reid. I'm a director of a Gold Partner NB Consult, and we're based out of the United Kingdom, South Africa and Hong Kong. You can reach me on Twitter at BrianReidC7. I'm a Microsoft Certified Master in Exchange Server and Office 365 and a Microsoft MVP. In the session today, we're going to look at the Azure AD Authentication Platform from the perspective of the administrator and the end user. All of your access to Microsoft 365 services such as Teams and Exchange Online, and all the user access to the admin portals and PowerShell and so on all need to be authenticated. So in this session, we're going to look at what is a very quick process, the authentication process. We're going to see what is happening in the visible foreground to the user and administrator, but also in the background, and how we can use that for troubleshooting and to improve security using it. So the first thing we're going to look at, by way of doing some pen drawings and some whiteboarding, is Azure AD Authentication, how it works, and then once we know how it works, it will lead us into troubleshooting and how we can improve security with it later on in the session.
We will look at it from the perspective of the user and the administrator. We're going to do this by the way of a pen cast. So I'm going to do some drawings and talk you through the drawings as I make them. Let's start off with Active Directory. So Active Directory is often shown as a triangle, so there's our Active Directory. And we've got in our Active Directory some users. And we've got in Active Directory some computers. That's my computer. I've got the ability to sync this information to the cloud, and that's Azure Active Directory Connect. AD Connect, just to make it a little bit quicker to write and say. Azure Active Directory Connect syncs the data. It's mostly one way. Okay? We're just going to do a little small arrow down. There's a tiny amount of data that we can write back with Azure Active Directory to Active Directory, but generally it's one way. Okay? And that places into Azure Active Directory the user and the computer. Now there's various settings to make this work, and you can configure and customize this, and that's not the purpose of this talk. The purpose of this talk, though, is to talk about how authentication works when all that's in place. Okay, so let's see the process. Okay. Now the user, when they were down in Active Directory, down here, the user when they were down here, they would have logged in Kerberos and so on to services that were on Active Directory file servers and so on. But when they're in the cloud, the services can be in either location. So the service could be, for example, Exchange Online. Let's write that as EXO. But the service could be, let's say a web app running on a web server on premises. Okay. We can set the applications up in Azure Active Directory, and then the user access the application. And here's the process for doing that. Okay. So we have my user, they're located on their computer, for example, and the user is going to go and access Exchange Online in this example. Okay. So the first thing they do is they make a connection to Exchange Online. Now we'll assume that they've not made any connection to Exchange Online before. It's a brand new machine. They've not logged on from this machine before. There's cookies stored in the memory of the browser or Outlook keeps information within Windows based on this logon. Let's assume that none of that's there. This is a brand new logon on that machine. And it's the same process, generally speaking, for the browser or for the application, the full client application like Outlook. Okay. We connect to Exchange Online, and Exchange Online says, I don't know who you are, please go and authenticate. And it sends a request back to the client and tells the client the endpoint of the authentication. The endpoint of the authentication in this case is Azure Active Directory. And so we connect up to Azure Active Directory, and that brings us in place for the authentication platform. We're given a presentation on the screen of our username and password. We enter our username, we click next. We enter our password, we click next. We can enter passwordless technologies, hardware tokens, and other stuff that's again outside the scope of this conversation. But there's a number of different ways we can authenticate. But generally speaking, we are proving who we are to Azure Active Directory. Azure Active Directory takes our authentication proofs and assures itself that that really is the person that's logging in, and issues to the user, and I'm going to do this in green, issues to the user an authentication token. The user holds this authentication token, and the token has two validities to, actually there's two tokens of a validity to each. I'll just draw it as one token for the moment. But we have what's called the refresh token. Okay, trying to spell and not doing it very well in my head. Okay, and 90 days. And then we have the access token, and that's by default 1 day. There's a number of things we can do to change the 1 hour. Let's just change that. And there's a number of things we can do to change the duration of the access token, but the default will be 1 hour. Okay. Let's clean up this diagram. Let's just take away a couple of those arrows that I've got on there. And we've now got our access token and our refresh token. Our refresh token is understood by Azure Active Directory. Our access token is understood by the service in question. The service in question has a relationship with Azure Active Directory. So Exchange Online has a relationship with Azure Active Directory. And so I can present to Exchange Online a token generated by Azure Active Directory, and Exchange Online understands that. So let's take my access token, and I'm going to present my access token with its hour validity to Exchange Online. Exchange Online trusts this token. It knows it was issued by Azure Active Directory, as I just said, and so Exchange Online presents back to the user the data of the application. So in this case, the mailbox. Okay, I'm able to view the mailbox. I'm able to view whatever Exchange Online knows that I have permission to, because it knows who I am. Time moves on, and the access token is invalidated. It's expired. An hour's gone by. I've been reading my email. Outlook's been running in the background. Whatever. Various things have been going on, and time has gone by. Okay. Exchange Online rejects my access token, and I need to go and get a new access token so I can continue my Exchange Online connectivity. Now this bit the user doesn't see. The user saw the initial login, but the user doesn't see the invalidation of the access token and the getting again of a new access token unless something material has changed. And we'll talk about a material change in a moment. Okay? So data is being accessed. Let's delete that. Delete my access token from there. And so from a Azure Active Directory perspective, the client with its now effectively invalidated access token, but it's still got, put an R in there, its refresh token. Its refresh token was 90 days in duration, so it's now 89 days and 23 hours. So it's got an amount of time. The client goes back to, the user goes back to Azure Active Directory, presents this time to Azure Active Directory the refresh token, and Azure Active Directory issues a new access token back to the user. It also issues back a new refresh token. So I've now got a 90-day refresh token, another 1 hour access token. The client presents the access token back to Exchange Online, and in every connection that I connect to Exchange Online, I'm always presenting the access token. So it's not something I present for an hour and then I don't do anything with for an hour. I present the access token, and then on the next TCP network connection I make, I present it again and again and again. I'm always presenting the access token. It's my method of access to the system. Okay? If I connect to Exchange Online without an access token, I'm told to go get one, which is how this process started. And so I remain connected for an hour, as that's the duration of my access token, and I keep accessing my data. And that last bit was seamless to the user. That first bit where the user logged in, they entered their credentials, obviously not seamless to the user, they see it, okay? But this hour later, that's carrying on and that's working very well. And I've got my access token for Exchange Online. Okay. Let's move over there a little bit. I'm going to generate myself a new service. Let's have SharePoint Online. It doesn't really matter that it's Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, or whatever. These are just services. Here they're first-party Microsoft 365 services. They could be the third-party services. I made a reference earlier to a web application on premises. It could be that application that I've authenticated via Azure Active Directory. It could be a web application in Azure. It could be a SaaS application that I've bought a license to, or so on. Okay. SharePoint is a very common example, so that will do. So my user is happily reading their email. They get a link to their intranet. They click the link to their intranet, and that's going to take them to SharePoint Online. In this example, they've not logged on to SharePoint Online. So the user connects up to SharePoint Online. SharePoint Online does not know who they are. SharePoint Online says to the user, go get me the access token. So the user connects up to Azure Active Directory. Now the difference this time is the user has the refresh token, and it's got just under 90 days valid on it. It's got an access token, but the access token is for Exchange Online. The access token is not for SharePoint, but the refresh token is for Azure Active Directory. So I present the refresh token, and from that I get back a new access token. The access token is for SharePoint. And so I'm then able to present to SharePoint my access token, which gives me 1 hour of access to SharePoint. That's an independent hour to my hour for Exchange Online. Over in Exchange Online, I'm happily having access to my data. Over in SharePoint, I'm happily having access to my data. When the hour token expires for both of these, I'll go and get another access token. So I'm hitting Azure Active Directory for every application about every hour once I've successfully logged in. Let's clean this diagram up a little bit and have a look at some extra stuff that's available to us in Azure Active Directory to help with the authentication process. We'll clean it up by moving it across over there, and we'll do some of my drawings again. So I've got my Active Directory, I've got my Azure Active Directory, AAD, I've got my user, computer, and so on. They're all synced up as before. And I've got my user, so my user here, my user sitting on their computer. What else can we do? Well, the first thing we could talk about here very briefly, because it's covered in other sessions in the Scottish Summit, is conditional access. Conditional access is I take some of the conditions of the login. So for example, it could be the group that I belong to. It could be the IP address where I'm located. It could be the join state of the computer to either Azure Active Directory or Intune, our cloud management platform. And you take a number of different properties, and then when I connect to Azure Active Directory to do my login, rather than just taking my username and password and saying that's good, it can do things like take my username and my password, and the fact may be that my computer is joined to Azure Active Directory. That's a hybrid join. A hybrid join is one where the computer is joined both to Active Directory and is also joined to Azure Active Directory. It's an Azure AD Connect component. Let's take away those arrows because they'll just get in the way. Okay? So that could be the join status. So it might be, for example, you could only access Exchange Online if you are on a company-owned machine. So I connect up to Exchange Online and I'm successful because I have the access token. The access token was only issued because I was successful in passing my conditional access rules. If I wasn't successful in passing my conditional access rules, then I wouldn't get the access token, and therefore I would have been denied access to Exchange Online. And that could be SharePoint. Again, that could be any service. In addition to conditional access as a way of controlling access into the service, I can also, let's clear the screen again, I can also take my user account, my computer again that I'm sitting on. Okay, let's have my computer on an IP address. This is the public IP address of the LAN of my home, because of course we're all working at home, my office, or wherever I happen to be working. Okay? That's the IP address I connect from. So it's not, for example, the 192.168 whatever address that the 192.168 address of my network, but it's the public IP of the computer as connected to Azure Active Directory. So it's the address as seen via the cloud. I can connect up to Azure Active Directory. So let's put that in. Let's draw my Azure Active Directory. And in my connection, I'm going to send up my public IP. It's going to know where I'm connecting from. Okay. And let's say conditional access allows that. Okay. But I still have this scenario that I described earlier where I get back my access token and I get back my refresh token if I'm successful, if conditional access allows me. And my access token is a 1 hour. Okay. What are some of the problems we could have with that? Well, we could have, let's say, a catastrophic outage of Azure Active Directory. It's not unknown, it's very rare, but there was one last September, for example. Azure Active Directory was offline for 4 hours, mostly for American time zones. It was offline globally, but in the UK and Europe, we mostly finished work. So unless you're working shifts or late or something like that, you weren't really impacted by it. Okay? Because you could have got your access token just before the outage. You could have been successfully connecting to the service. An hour later, you tried to connect to Azure Active Directory was down. Okay? Well, let's take away a catastrophic issue. Let's have an issue, let's say, with my public network. Obviously, my public network goes down. I can't connect to any of my services. I'm in cached mode in Outlook, for example. Teams have started to introduce offline mode. Certainly it's been announced in the roadmap that it's coming. And we start moving into those scenarios. But let's say I've got something like, let's put a double line there. Let's say I've got a proxy for my connectivity. And something happens to my proxy, someone changes the settings on my proxy, proxy has a problem, and it's actually Azure Active Directory that becomes unavailable to my network and not Exchange Online. Again, these are rare scenarios, but it's possible that it could happen. And so we have a scenario whereby we come back after our hour and we can't authenticate. We're not able to reach Azure Active Directory, we're not able to refresh the token. Okay. So let's take Azure Active Directory and a new feature. I'm really having a problem writing. There we go. And a new feature called Continuous Access Evaluation. I'm going to write it as CAE because it's going to take too long to write up on the screen. Continuous Access Evaluation. And you turn this on in the security setting of Azure Active Directory. It's currently in preview. And you can enable it for a group of a user, a group of users, or everybody. And the idea of continuous access evaluation is that it gives you tokens of up to 28 hours, and the up to bit's important, but it's continuously evaluating your access. So let's take my user. My user connects up to Azure Active Directory. Obviously, first, of course, they've connected to Exchange Online, and Exchange Online said, "Who are you? I don't know who you are. Please go to Azure Active Directory." Azure Active Directory authenticates me. And this time it sends back for me my refresh token and my access token, but my access token is valid for 28 hours. And so I connect to Exchange Online and I stay connected to Exchange Online now for +1 day. Let's say, as we were talking about outages, let's say Azure Active Directory had an outage. We don't notice. Obviously, if the outage is still ongoing, or it happens to be ongoing at the point where we try and refresh our token after 28 hours, we're going to notice. But there's a much greater chance of an outage being seen if we have to go back every hour. So if we only have to go back every day or thereabouts, then we're much more robust to cloud issues issues with network connectivity and so on that might cause a problem with reaching the authentication service. Okay. This can be especially interesting if I've got things like ADFS as my authentication platform plugged into Azure Active Directory. So I'm actually being authenticated by ADFS. I've got a handful of servers that I'm reliant on, rather than a cloud of services that I'm reliant upon. But you might think, well, this makes it less secure. What happens if the user, for example, gets into their car and drives down to their local coffee shop? There we go. Let's have a drink with a straw. And my IP address has changed. Well, I might consider the service that they're accessing highly secure, and I'd actually not want them, and that IP address should be blocked. Or let's say the user leaves the company, and actually I want to disable their account. Well, their account isn't disabled because we don't go back and check Azure Active Directory for up to 1 day. Because we don't go back and check it, we don't see these changes have happened. Let's take those away for a second. Continuous access evaluation implies by its name that there's something continuous going on in all this. And what's going on is Azure Active Directory is telling Exchange Online material changes to the account. Unlike the scenario which actually we didn't discuss, which was after the hour I go back to Azure Active Directory, and now Azure Active Directory says, oh, now your rights to log into the service are invalid. Okay, so after 1 hour, for example, my account was disabled, or after 1 hour my password had changed and I need to authenticate again, or after 1 hour I changed IP address and the IP address is not valid and so I fail conditional access. In all those scenarios, I could stay connected for up to that hour, while really I shouldn't have had access. But continuous access evaluation is a material change to the user account. For example, the password change happens, or the user's IP address changes, or the account is blocked. User leaves the company or whatever, account is disabled. These are all material changes to the account, and that information is pushed to Exchange Online. It can also be pushed to Teams and SharePoint. It's only Exchange Online, Teams and SharePoint that supports continuous access evaluation, but it's a working group to make this work as part of the OAuth protocol, which is the underlying pinnings of all of what we've been talking about. And so other applications will begin to support this. This is who it is at the moment, and that's mostly the reason why it's preview. So if we're using one of these particular applications, Azure Active Directory tells Exchange Online, for example, that my IP address has changed. Exchange Online knows what are my trusted IPs from a conditional access perspective, and it sees me connecting from a new IP address. It sees that Azure Active Directory has told it, at some other point in time, the IP addresses that I'm allowed to connect from. And so Exchange Online says, no, your access token is not valid. Now, the access token is still valid from time, but now the access token is invalid for another reason. And so we go back to Azure Active Directory to get our new access token. And it might be, for example, that if I'm working outside of the office IPs, I need to do multi-factor authentication before I would get an access token. But it may well be that actually I'm not allowed to connect, and so my account is going to be blocked instead. And so I don't get an access token, and so I don't continue my access to Exchange Online. It doesn't really matter what the change of event is. The change of event happens. Exchange Online rejects my access token, and so I can't connect to my data over an Exchange Online, and so I have to refresh my access token. And so continuous access evaluation can be up to 28 hours. After the 28 hours, the token expires by time, and so obviously I go back and get a new access token and I carry on. Okay. But it means that I go to Azure Active Directory much less. I go to Azure Active Directory when I need to, rather than because I have to on the hour. I go to Azure Active Directory because my password has changed, my account has expired. Obviously, if my account has expired, I'm not going to get back in. Okay. And so that gives me a view of the authentication process, plus some new features such as continuous access evaluation. And we spoke earlier about, we spoke about having conditions of access as well. And they all fit into my authentication package so that my user can sign in successfully, not be prompted for the password all the time, because actually that can prompt the user into thinking that they should always enter their password whenever they're asked for it, and that's a bad place to be. Okay? But we have the ability to log in, we have the ability to get our tokens, we can see our tokens and how they flow between the application, Exchange Online in this case, and Azure Active Directory. They flow via the user. And as they flow via the user is responsible for handing them to the service. And we had over here, for example, SharePoint Online. And so the user has the token, and the user handling the token that way and handling the token that way, different tokens for different services. And while all this is happening, we are authenticated and we have access to the system. From the user perspective, a lot of this is trivial and tiny. It just happens in the background. We don't see it happening. Obviously, the first authentication we do see, unless we've done single sign-on, which again is a different topic, and authentication is based on the computing device that we're on and the user, and we're not specifically asked for our credentials. We see it a lot less if we have continuous access evaluation turned on, but we see it when we need to, for example, when my account expires, and so on.
Now that we've seen how the login process works, we've seen continuous access evaluation to allow an extended token length. And we've seen that we have our refresh tokens of a considerable duration and our access tokens of an hour or longer with continuous access evaluation. Let's have a look at how we can do some troubleshooting on Azure Active Directory. What happens when the sign-in process goes wrong? How can we tell? What happens with things like conditional access, which will extend further in our final section on security, and how we can increase security in Azure Active Directory coming up shortly. But how we can look at the problems that can occur, how we can see what those problems are, and how we can resolve them. Let's move to our screen and take a look at that. In the Troubleshooting Azure Active Directory section, we're going to have a look at my tenant. We can see I'm looking here at my page, the profile of my user account. I'm logged in though as a different admin account, and I'm able to do global admin here. I'm able to look around all the settings. Exactly what you can see depends upon the roles that you have within Azure Active Directory. To get to this, I've gone to the portal, so it's portal.azure.com in the browser, and I've signed in. And because I've signed in as an admin, my access token has given me access to the portal. It may be that I don't have access to the portal as a user, and that's something that can be turned off. But as an admin, I can go into the portal, I can look at the details. For example, here I can see my email address, my sign-in name, my profile picture, my recent sign-ins, the groups I belong to, and so on. And all this will help with my troubleshooting. What can we have a look at here? From a sign-in perspective, let's take a look at sign-ins. On the left-hand side under Activity, I've got the sign-in section. And the sign-in section will show me the last 24 hours of sign-ins for my user identity. That's because I started and I went to the sign-ins page when I was on my user identity. I can get to the sign-ins page from the home page of the Azure Active Directory portal, and it will show me all the sign-ins for the period of time that we've selected. So here we can see my user sign-ins interactive. And the last 24 hours, and I could change the time period. I'm not going to bother changing the time period here, but I can go up to 30 days if I've got an Azure AD P1 license, but I can go 7 days if I'm on an Office 365 basic license. And I've got the ability to add some filters to filter the information down. We'll come back to filters later, maybe. So let's have a look and see what we can do. Okay. Let's just take a look at this bottom one. Okay. I've gone to the Microsoft 365 Security and Compliance Center, and I did that yesterday at 1 o'clock. So just within 24 hours, and I can click on this and see some information about that. Okay. So for example, the date, the time, the methods of authentication, the resource that I've accessed the Active Directory, and I've used the Security and Compliance Center to do this. In this particular case, I was opening the quarantine to have a look at some phish emails that had been stopped. So I know what I was doing. Where was I doing it from? I was doing it from Oxford, where I live. And from a device, I was doing it from a compliant and managed device. Compliant, the device is registered in Intune. Managed, same thing, it's in Intune. And compliant, it meets the compliance rules for my device in Intune. It's also an Azure AD joined device. And information about my browser, so that's New Edge, is displayed there, and my operating system. In terms of authentication, I had previously logged in. This wasn't the login. I wasn't actively logging in to get to this page. I opened it and it worked. Okay? And it worked because I was signed into Windows and SSO was enabled. Okay? And so my requirements of factor were satisfied by the token. The token said I had enough information to log into this resource. In terms of conditional access, I've got my conditional access rules listed and I can have a look. So for example, there's a whole bunch that don't apply, so we'll ignore those. Okay? But in this particular case, there was a keep me signed in for the UK users. It gives me a persistent sign-in browser. So once I've logged in, as long as I don't change browser or device, I stay signed in. I'm not continually prompted for a sign-in. Okay? And so I can set that as a session control. The rest of the rules, for example, blocking levers and MFA always if the application is Twitter, they don't apply because in this case the application wasn't Twitter. I wasn't logged in as an admin and a few other things that are set here. My previous authentication applied. And under additional details, I've got is CAE token. Was this a continuous access evaluation token? It wasn't. That's because the Security and Compliance Center doesn't support that. If this was a Teams login or an Exchange Online login or a SharePoint login, then I would be able to see true for that. Let's have a look at my non-interactive sign-ins. My non-interactive sign-ins, again, for the last 24 hours, will show me the stuff that I signed in the background. I'm not necessarily aware that the sign-in has happened. For example, let's take a look at Microsoft Edge. And we expand the section and it should show me some information. Now, the last couple of days, it's been showing, it's been sporadic in whether it works or not. This one's worked. So let's click on a particular one. Okay? And we've got stuff like additional details, what API was used and so on. Again, is it a continuous access evaluation token? But we can go and look at the various tabs and see the similar information, okay? And find out what was going on, etc. So this was from my phone, and again this phone was registered in Intune. And so these are all treated as, in my case, a second factor of authentication. And so you'll have noticed that it's a single factor of authentication and I haven't got MFA. That's because the devices I'm using haven't required MFA, okay? Because I'm on a company trusted device. If I was to look at somebody not on a company trusted device, I would see references to MFA in here. Okay. Talking of MFA, authentication methods on the left are the ways that the user signs into Azure AD and can perform self-service password reset. Our system ran into an issue. Please try again in a few minutes. Let me hit refresh on that page and just see if I can fix that. No, we're having issues today with Azure AD. What I should see here is I should see the telephone numbers and the authenticator apps that I'm using for MFA. It's not a lot of detail. This is from an administrative perspective, just to say that yes, you have registered. Okay. Let's take a look back in Azure Active Directory, and we can scroll down, for example, to Usage and Insights under Monitoring. And Usage and Insights under Monitoring, and this is for all users, I can go Authentication Methods Activity, where I can look at who's registered for MFA, the registrations in the past, by default 30 days, there's not been many registrations, and registrations for self-service password reset. Okay. And also the usage, which is all self-service password reset based. But for example, I can click and say, who's not registered, or users registered for, and I can filter for that. So let's have just a quick look. For example, I'm going to search for me. Click apply. And we can see my name comes up. I'm registered for self-service password reset. I'm registered for MFA, and the methods that I'm registered for are listed over on the right. Again, the visibility to the administrator of things like the phone number and stuff like that does depend on the administrator's level, but by default is not shown. So it's just these are methods that are registered for me to do MFA against. And so let's say things like MFA stopped working, that'd be troubleshooting. We could come and look at here and see what methods the user would have. We could go to the sign-in logs like we saw before, and we'll be looking for things like failures. Let's go and have a look, for example, at the sign-ins for the entire tenant. And I'm going to add some filters. I'm going to say where the status is a failure. Let's see who's failed to log in. And a failure to log in could be, for example, so we have this top row here, and the failure to log in here was failure reason, something to do with the application that was running, had a problem. Let's go Microsoft Authenticated down here. There's an obvious one. Failed due to invalid credentials, username or password. Well, we've got the user's username listed in the directory, therefore it's going to be the invalid password. If the user typed in the wrong username, it couldn't be associated with my tenant, and so I wouldn't see the sign-in details here in the tenant. Okay. But I can see, for example, that the username is listed, therefore they've got their password wrong. Okay. And that's probably in the setup of the Authenticator app. Okay. And so I can filter through all this information and find out what's going on and troubleshoot a lot further. Okay. And so there's a great amount of information here. Okay. Let's go back to me as a user. And I've got to diagnose and solve problems. And this could be your first point of call for troubleshooting. Okay. And again, we selected the user, and let's say we had let's pick something that might be interesting. A problem inviting a guest user. They report that as an issue. I could troubleshoot it, and it will give me the steps to work through that. It's a manual fix. Okay. I might have an automated one. Why can't I update the properties of the user in my directory? Again, manual steps to this fix the issue. And so we've got some walkthroughs that we can do. Okay. Finally, for troubleshooting, it's useful to have a look at the applications that I have access to, because it may be that actually the sign-in worked, but it was the application that the user was trying to go to that didn't have permission to. Again, it's important to know that there's the sign-in process followed by access to the application. I may sign in successfully, but having signed in, I may find that I haven't got access to the application given to me. Okay. So for example, here I've got the Graph Explorer and it's directly assigned to me. So if I went to the Graph Explorer, I should expect the Graph Explorer to work. But if there was an application not listed here and I tried to access that application and sign in, I might expect a different error. Okay. Our final section of my talk is to look at improving security in Azure Active Directory. Here we'll have a look at conditional access and multi-factor authentication, and we'll see how they improve the security of the login process and how they fit in with the login process. For example, we've looked already at troubleshooting, and we've looked earlier in the session at how the tokens all work. Security has to fit in with that process, and that's what we'll look at next. Let's take a look over here. So we've got our portal. We're signed in again still as my user account, signed as my admin account, looking at my user account. Okay. And we've seen when we looked at the troubleshooting for an individual user, we could see the conditional access rules that apply to them. Before we have a look at conditional access rules, let's take a look at some of the more advanced settings that are available to us. These are available in Azure Active Directory P2 license, which is part of the Enterprise Mobility Suite E5 license if you buy the whole package. I've got a tab open for this, for these two features. First feature is identity protection. So an Azure AD P2 feature. And what this allows me to do is to assign user risk and sign-in risk policies and to improve the Mfa registration policy. Let's have a look at the Mfa registration process itself. Okay. In this particular tenant, the policy is on. Okay. And for all users excluding 3, probably service accounts without looking at them, all users go through the Mfa registration process. Normally Mfa is required at the point where you hit a conditional access rule that says you need MFA. And if you haven't registered at that point, you have to register and then you're allowed in. the Mfa registration policy will kick in at the next login and will give you a 14-day grace period in which you can choose to do your registration. So you can control the rollout of it. Users will get to be asked to register even if they're not hitting an endpoint that requires MFA. So for example, let's say you've got a conditional access rule that says MFA required outside the network, and you want to get people to register inside the network. Well, you can send them a link to the registration portal, aka.ms/MFA setup, for example. But if you have the MFA registration policy in place and those users are included in it, then at the next login, they'll be asked and said the user has some more details. On my blog at c7solutions.com, I've got a couple of videos of the process that runs through that if you're interested in the full user experience process that you can get based on which settings you have turned on. But once you've registered, there's also with identity protection, user risk and sign-in risk policy. Sign-in risk policy happens in real time. User risk is behind, it's after a sign-in event. It applies to a group of users. And what we've said here is the risk. And so in this particular example, if a user's risk, the user risk goes high, then the user will be required to change their password. What might make the risk go high? Compromise is the best example here. Microsoft see a compromise of the account, they'll raise the user risk. So it's not based on my sign-in, but it's based on activity that's happened to my account, maybe somebody else logging in as my account. A sign-in risk policy, very similar idea. Okay. Again, you can set your own risk level, okay, and you can say it applies to and require multi-factor authentication. So for example, I said earlier that if I have things like sign-in, continuous active evaluation enabled, I have keep me sign in session controls turned on, all of those we saw in the last few minutes in the previous section, okay, then I won't get repeatedly prompted for MFA, and that's a good thing. But what happens if my risk goes up? Well, in this case, my sign-in risk goes up, medium and above. Maybe I sign in from a place that I've not signed into from before. Maybe my account is being, I've got a VPN open and I'm connected to another country and everything's going via that country. But minutes ago, I was in this country. Suddenly I'm somewhere else. Is that a sign-in risk? The first time that happens, absolutely. If it repeatedly happens and I repeatedly successfully sign in, it probably is me. And so my sign-in risk might stay low in that case, but in the initial instance, it may go up. Okay? And so I may require multi-factor authentication. And if I successfully complete multi-factor authentication, because it's me, then my sign-in risk goes back down again. It automatically remediates. I've also got a bunch of reports and the ability to send emails and weekly digest reports on identity protection as well. That's all part of Azure AD P2. Also in Azure AD P2, to improve my security, is the privileged identity management. This is to limit the roles that are available to someone all the time. Roles become illegible rather than roles get guaranteed. Okay. And so and without going into detail on this, because you could spend a whole session and longer looking at this, let's just briefly have a look at managed roles. And we'll see all the roles in Azure Active Directory. And if I scroll down to our classic global administrator role, in this tenant, for example, I can see we have 4 global administrators, but we have 7 people who are eligible to become global administrator. They request the right to be global administrator, and then it gets approved, but they're not global administrator by default. So they have an admin account, as in we've designated an account for them to have admin too, and we've given that admin account eligibility to become global admin, but they're not a global admin. We have some permanent global admins, just in case PIM doesn't work. In case PIM breaks, we can always sign as a global admin if we need to, but we should spend our time signing in as our accounts which are eligible for it. And in terms of PIM, we can have time-based eligibility as well. So for example, you become eligible for it, and let's say 8 hours later, you stop being eligible for it, and you have to apply for it again. Okay. So these are options that are available to help improve the security of my login process, my Azure Active Directory tenant. So let's go back to the top of the tenant. Scroll down to security and click on conditional access. And I have a number of conditional access rules. Okay. Coming soon is going to be the ability to sort these columns. It's not in this tenant at the moment, but I saw it in one of my customer tenants yesterday. And the ability to filter and sort is rolling out as we speak. A very nice feature. Let's take a look at the one that we mentioned earlier, Twitter, MFA always. Okay, this is a rule that is specific to a single application and requires MFA all the time. So if I use my Azure Active Directory account to sign into company Twitter account, then for any user, one app included, that one app is the Twitter app in the directory. The condition will be not using a basic authentication, so that's a default setting on this. So and there isn't a legacy or basic authentication for Twitter anyway. Okay. And in terms of grant controls, I require multi-factor authentication. Okay. So if I tried to sign into Twitter for the company account, then it would prompt an MFA at that point. Okay. If I'd already got an MFA sign in within my token, then the Twitter requirement of or the Azure Active Directory requirement when accessing Twitter of MFA at sign into Twitter, well, that would already been passed because it's already in my token. So it's not a requirement that I'm going to see a prompt. It's I must have signed into the session with MFA. If I haven't signed into the session using MFA, then I would get a prompt. But in this case, it may not be the case that I will always see an MFA prompt. But if I haven't got an MFA prompt, then I will have one. Okay? And that's an example of a fairly simple conditional access control. The best conditional access controls that are available for us will be things like, rather than things like Twitter, it's going to be all apps, all users, all the time, with maybe some exceptions. Okay? So for example, let's have create a new one, or external, let's call it. Okay? And so I might do something like all users, which is going to include guests, and it tells me it's going to include me, and it recommends I test this before I do it. I'm not going to save this one, and so I'm not going to actually do the test process. But yes, pick a few people. So you would go select users and groups, and you'd select the users and groups that you want to use to do that. Select the apps that I'm going to use. I'm going to say all apps. Now, there's a couple of exceptions that I need to do this. For example, we do Azure Information Protection. And Azure Information Protection, when sending or sharing sensitivity labels across organizations, doesn't work if I have MFA enabled. And so that will be an example of an app I might exclude from it. But I'm going to be generally inclusive of all the apps in the organization. In terms of conditions, I might say, for example, let's exclude all the trusted locations. And so it's not going to happen in an office. I've done some other authentication, door pass, security, type of coding, etc., whatever, to get into the building. Okay? So I'm on the network. But if I'm outside, I may require MFA. Okay? And then in terms of my grant controls, I'm going to require MFA. Okay? We can see here I can require the device to be compliant and in tune. Another thing I could do is let's go back to conditions. And I could say device state, and I could say exclude compliant devices. So if you've got a compliant device, it's going to be all external unless you're on a company device. The company device is my MFA in effect. If I'm logged into a company device, then I've done my MFA. And so I would say something like all users, all apps, conditions would be any location except for when I'm carrying a company device with me. And then the grant control would be require MFA. Okay? And it defaults to put it on in report only mode, so you can see what would happen. Okay? And some warnings about that. Okay? So I'm just going to cancel. I'm not going to save that one, but that would be an example of setting up a conditional access policy. Conditional access requires Azure Active Directory P1. And so if you haven't got conditional access, user settings, properties of the directory, security defaults, and we can turn on security defaults, and that does a lot of the basic stuff for you without having to think about it. Okay? You can't turn on security defaults if you've got conditional access, and so security defaults is for organizations that don't have Azure AD P1, and you just turn it on, a basic set of security recommendations. And we'll finish on that. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you for attending the Scottish Summit. Do look up the sites of the sponsors, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the talks you go to. My name is Reid. Good afternoon.